A self-defense case that goes to trial is typically all or nothing.
One of the problems with warning shots in many instances is people go, well, I'm just going to shoot over their heads. They have no idea where that bullet is going to land.
So the consequences, even though he's not in prison for murder and he hasn't been convicted, there's serious consequences to these warning shots that he fired.
This is the In Self-Defense Podcast with Don West, Steve Moses, and Sean Vincent, exploring high-profile self-defense cases and identifying the lessons learned for concealed carriers.
Hey everybody, I'm Sean Vincent. Thanks for joining the podcast today. Today we're going to be talking about the case of George Allen Kelly. He is the Arizona rancher that lived near the border. He was arrested for murder after what he claimed was firing warning shots at some illegal migrants who were crossing and trespassing on his borderlands property. One of those migrants was found dead, shot in the back. The case went to trial. There were 8 jurors. 7 of them voted for acquittal. 1 voted for guilt. That was enough for the judge to declare a mistrial. The jury hanged, or was hung. It was a hung jury anyway. And as a result, George Kelly is free, not quite exonerated. The prosecutors said they're not going to try the case again, but reserve the right, they hope, to try it again if new evidence or new testimony comes forward. We're going to talk about the lessons from that case today. I'm going to be joined by Don West. He's National Trial Counsel for CCW Safe. Our friend Steve Moses. He's a well-regarded firearms trainer and instructor. And some of the big lessons that we got from this case that we're going to talk about is this concept of prairie justice. When you're in a place where there is lawlessness, are you more justified in using deadly force? Legally, no, but we're going to talk about what this hung jury says about that. We're going to talk about, we're going to have a warning about warning shots, why they're legally never a very good idea, and what some of the real life and death problems are with warning shots. And then finally, we're going to have a conversation about the idea that nobody wins as a defendant, a criminal prosecution. The best you can do is survive it. George Allen Kelly's trial is a testament to that. He spent 22 days in jail when he was first arrested. The defense cost him $2 million, and now he's got this prospect that he could be prosecuted again in the future looming over the head for the rest of his life. We're going to talk about that and more in my conversation with Don West and Steve Moses about the George Allen Kelly self-defense mistrial. We're going to revisit the George Allen Kelly case. I learned from the reporting on this that he goes by Allen, not George. So we'll call him Allen when we refer to him by his first name. And for those, I think everyone who's listening to us, for the most part, has heard of this case. It's a real high-profile case out in, he's from Arizona. He lives near the border. He has a ranch there. He's in his 70s. He's retired with his wife. And he's sick and tired of illegal immigrants crossing his property. And he had a scenario a while back where he spotted some men on his property. He claimed that he had heard a shot fired. He claimed that they were armed, that they had pointed a rifle in the direction of his house, and he got his AK-47 and fired what he told authorities were multiple warning shots over their heads. And he reported the problem with people crossing his property multiple times to the Border Patrol. They came out and searched after he had fired those rounds. Later in that evening, I think it was his dogs uncovered this body. So one of the people who had been crossing his property was found face down, shot in the back. No bullets were found, but they did find the shell casings from the AK-47 where he fired by his property, by his house. They arrested him. They charged him with murder, and recently he had a trial. The defense was essentially that they were warning shots.
he was scared for his life. He was justified in using self-defense, even if they were just warning shots. And that this is interesting. Part of the theme of this is that the lawyer even told the jurors this. The defense lawyer told the jurors that the rules are different because the border is an increasingly dangerous place. And I think what she was doing there was trying to appeal to the sympathies of people who live near the border who are frustrated with illegal immigration and people crossing the borders who feel it has become more dangerous. And the result was of this trial that there were 8 jurors in this case. 7 of them wanted to acquit him, and 1 juror was just obstinate and decided they wanted to convict him of murder no matter what. And they convinced the judge that they couldn't come to an agreement. Judge declared a mistrial. George Kelly is now a free man. The prosecutor said they're not going to retry this case, but also that they're asking the judge right now, and we're talking on June 6th, 2024, they've asked the judge to dismiss the case without prejudice because if new evidence or new witnesses appear, they'd like to retry this case, potentially. They want to have the right to do that. So, Don, I think I always thought mistrials were an extraordinary result in a trial, but in the time that I've been working on self-defense cases with you and watching high-profile self-defense cases in the press, they're a lot more common, I think, in self-defense cases than maybe in other cases.
I think that's right. And part of it is because a self-defense case that goes to trial is typically all or nothing. You're either guilty of a very serious charge, maybe the most serious charge that's alleged, or not guilty at all. If the jury agrees that the prosecutor hasn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that you did not act in self-defense, which then the question becomes, well, if you acted in self-defense, it's not guilty of anything. If you didn't act in self-defense, it's guilty of any crime that has been proven. So I think because these things are so tricky and so difficult, especially if there are facts that are in dispute, that depending on how you interpret those facts, it may shift the whole case in one direction or another. It's not unlikely at all to find reasonable people disagreeing about the evidence and even how the law might apply to that evidence. So sure, I think the circumstances are more likely than in many other kinds of cases for a hung jury and then ultimately a mistrial, less likely for a compromise verdict. That's what I think you find more often, where if a jury can't agree unanimously that the main charge has been proven, they may come around and they may just, for the spirit of reaching a verdict, may agree on a lesser charge, a guilty verdict nonetheless, but maybe not the main charge. Less likely in a self-defense case.
Well, because self-defense is justification for all the charges related to the use of force, no matter what they are, right? So if in self-defense you're justified in against the second-degree murder charge, then you should be against the manslaughter charge too, or an assault charge, if you were justified in using the force, is the idea.
That's exactly right. All the way down to seemingly insignificant criminal charges like discharging a firearm, something like that. So sure, a self-defense claim should apply across the board to any prosecution where self-defense could apply, and which means that you would have the justification to use force to some. The justification to use whatever degree of force would be authorized by the circumstances.
Steve, part of this case got a little bit confused because in the end, the claim was always that George Allen Kelly was firing warning shots above the heads of these folks. And one of the defenses was they never found the bullet that went through. When we did our podcast on this, you told our listeners that there's a good chance that bullet might be in Mexico, because I don't think he was more than 100 yards from the border. And so all they had was the bullet wound. They were never able to definitively match up the wound with his rifle. And part of the defense was he could have just as easily been killed by drug cartel members on the property. They can't prove that it was Kelly's bullet that did it. And it brings up a couple of things that I've heard you mention before. The problem with warning shots, for one, and then also being responsible for every round that you fire, no matter whether your intention is a warning shot or self-defense.
Yeah, I completely agree. Again, I'm not a fan of warning shots. I advise against them. If someone feels like I don't care, I've got to do this anyway, then you still have to follow all of the 4 basic handgun or firearm safety rules, and that is, know your target and what is behind it, around it, in front of it, which means you are going to be responsible for the terminal resting place of that round, whether it was a shot fired as a warning shot, which again we advise against, or even a legitimate use of defensive force. You're forced to defend yourself, like in a Walmart parking lot. And so, to that end, one of the problems with warning shots in many instances is people go, well, I'm just going to shoot over their heads. They have no idea where that bullet is going to land. And if I am not mistaken, I believe that he may have fired as many as 9 so-called warning shots. And firing an AK-47, it has a reasonable amount of what we're going to call, it's not so much significant recoil, it's got quite a bit of muzzle flip, especially if you're not holding it tightly, you don't have your sights on the target, and your objective is to hit this area, and that's where the bullet stops. So if I take that AK-47 and I raise it over their heads, and at 100 yards, it doesn't take much muzzle deviation to affect where you thought you were aiming, where the bullet went, and I fired 9 rounds rapid fire, that muzzle is going to be bouncing up and down. Now, if you want to do that and you want to let it shoot around, let it come down, and then make sure I'm going to put it in the same place, that's one thing. Again, I'm not advocating warning shots, but if you're just doing that, for lack of a better term, haphazardly, there is no telling where that muzzle was actually oriented at the time that bullet left that muzzle, and that bullet's probably traveling somewhere around 2,300 feet per second. So I just caution armed, defenders, armed homeowners, concealed carriers, is you just got to be very, very mindful of where that bullet's going to end up if you feel compelled to use it.
So what I hear you saying is that, so if he was firing warning shots, it's probably a pretty safe assumption that he wasn't picking a specific spot in the sky that he was aiming for and reacquiring after every round that he fired, right? He was probably in a pretty excited state, firing multiple rounds pretty quickly. And your experience with AK-47 is that muzzle is going to move around a lot. So it's very possible and perhaps even likely that even if his intention was warning shots, he could have easily shot lower than he really thought he did.
Oh, absolutely. Now, I'm not that good at geometry. I was better at geometry than I was algebra. I was horrible at algebra. Yeah. But I do know this. If I'm at 100 yards and I'm aiming at a target and I maybe move my muzzle 1 inch just as I press the trigger, it's going to miss that target, not by inches. It's going to miss it by feet.
Right. Don, there's something that after the mistrial, George Allen Kelly, he did an interview with News Nation, which covered this thing with a lot of in-depth. They had good coverage from the very beginning, and very balanced coverage too, I thought. And he told, well, actually, you know what? I'm going to go to his what Fox News reported, that he ended up spending some time in jail when he was first arrested, and he talked about his experience in jail, and he said that it was, what they report here is the 75-year-old man spent 22 days in jail, which he said was the worst experience of his life. If hell is anything like that, he says, I'm going to do everything I can not to go. And I bring this up because I don't think most folks have a real understanding of what it's like to be in jail. And even though this is a mistrial and the prosecutors say they're not going to try him again, and it looks unlikely that he'll face prosecution again in the future, he did spend time in jail. And they report that he spent about $2 million on his defense. And because of the way the case disposed, he still faces the possibility that this is a cloud over his head until maybe the judge says that they can't charge him again. But if he doesn't say that, then this is something that's going to haunt him for the rest of his life. So the consequences, even though he's not in prison for murder and he hasn't been convicted, there's serious consequences to these warning shots that he fired.
Well, it immediately resulted, or soon after the investigation began, resulted in him being arrested and being held without bond. I think that's where most of the 22 days came in until bail could be arranged. It was denied, I think, early on. He was, in fact, in a county jail type facility or city jail facility. He wasn't in a state prison or penitentiary. So as bad as it was for him, it's probably better than it would have been had he been convicted and sent to prison somewhere. He felt the isolation. He ate the bad food that you typically get. He made all sorts of new friends that he will never, ever want to talk with again.
No, they're not on his Christmas card list, you don't think?
Exactly. But more importantly, what he probably is talking about, he experienced the utter helplessness of being there and being alone in a room with 200 people in it. Fearful that he couldn't protect himself if somebody wanted to be physical or attack him for some reason. And that's true. He probably couldn't. I don't know if he spent any of that time in isolation. It's possible that he could have, and he certainly would have had he been threatened in some way. But it was a very miserable experience for him, as you can tell. I've been in city jails and county jails and state prisons and federal prisons, including the maximum security prison that they call Supermax. In the bowels of it, I've probably spent more than 22 days in my lifetime in these facilities. And I tell you, the fact that I knew I would be going home at the end of the day is the thing that saved me. Oh, what miserable, horrible, oppressive places. So he's not joking about that. And just the idea of facing that and knowing if there's anything you can do as your self-defense case unwinds to minimize the risk, eliminate the risk of you going through that process, spending even 22 days, much less 22 years in custody, is certainly worth all of the effort and all of the training and all of the good work that it would take and hard work it would take to put yourself in the best possible situation for that not to happen.
Yeah. Steve, I want to read this. The New Yorker, no matter what you think of the magazine, did a pretty interesting write-up where they attended the trial and they had some unique insight here. And this reporter wrote that throughout the trial, Larkin and Kelly's other defense attorney, Kathy Lothrop, returned repeatedly to the idea that the borderlands are a dangerous zone where different rules apply. This is a way to intimate that someone else could have killed this person, but also, perhaps more important, it was a way to frame Kelly's action as a reasonable response to a lawless, threatening environment. And I want to get your response to that because, one, and Don, I think you can agree with this, the laws of self-defense do not change just because you live near the border and that maybe illegal immigrants may cross your property. So she's legally wrong about that. But thematically, she struck a nerve because this jury, I think, were people who were sympathetic to what this rancher was dealing with. And were also probably tired of the problem of illegal immigration. Mm-hmm. And it was the jurors who sat and judged with him that were ultimately going to decide whether he was reasonable. And so I bring it up to you because I know you as a trainer, you deal with lots of different people with lots of different skill levels and lots of different, I don't know, a length of time that they've been decided to be armed defenders.
Yes, sir.
And I think there's often I'm specifically concerned with self-defense and home defense perspective, but then there's also what I like to call sort of a prairie justice sense that
Yes.
some armed defenders have that I completely understand, but that I've seen get people into trouble. And I think there's
Yes,
a
sir.
prairie justice effect in this case.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Again, I think the number one rule in terms of dealing with a potential gunfight is don't get shot. And so he probably had two options. One is to go ahead and do something, maybe like he did, which is not only possibly illegal, but can cause all sorts of problems. Or the second one, which works really well, even if you're not armed, is just move. So if he's got someone down there that is threatening him, especially at an extended distance, and he removes himself from the scene or gets behind cover or takes some other action, then the chances are that if it actually does go to guns, he's less likely to get himself shot or his wife. So that's kind of my attitude. I understand it. People are tired, of being victims. They want to do something about it, but in many instances, all they are doing is they're just setting themselves up for a really hard time, potentially for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, but the only help he gets in that situation is self-help. He can't call for a police response and expect there to be a police response in any reasonable amount of time that could remove him, his wife, from danger. The claim was he saw these guys with guns, with rifles, AK-47s. They were pointed at him. He had nothing between where they were and where he was on the house, and he felt compelled that to keep them at bay. I think that's what his thinking was, whether legally he was allowed to do that or even if it was a reasonable response. I think, Sean, that's what you're talking about. Maybe that sort of thinking wouldn't be reasonable other places. But where he was, it was more reasonable to think he had to do something to keep these intruders away, because it's undisputed that they were illegal in that they came into the country illegally for a purpose, whether they were simply coming in to get a better life for themselves or participating in a smuggling ring or were part of drug cartels. Who knows? Nobody knows at that point, except they're there illegally
And they're trespassing on his property.
and they're getting close to his house and they're carrying a gun. And no doubt his concern, maybe rising to the level of fear, was perhaps spiced up a little bit with his anger and his frustration that nothing is being done to help him. He has to deal with this himself. He's tired of it. And maybe that motivated him to do something he wouldn't have done if he were really looking at this more objectively. But I think
I wouldn't disagree with any of that. However, probably in retrospect, if he looks back and he thought of whatever other options he had, one of them would to have been start moving. If he'd have done that, then I think the chances are that indeed, if they had started shooting him, if I've got guys down there with guns and I'm here, I don't want to stand here and exchange shots with those guys unless I'm in the Arctic. I'm out there on the prairie. There's no place to go. I suspect that he was probably within 50 yards or so of something that he could have gotten behind. And when you sit there in that jail cell on your mattress and you replay all of the things that you wish you had done, I suspect that might have been one of the ones he wished that he had selected. And in terms of nothing more than just lessons learned for concealed carriers and armed defenders, it's just that in many instances, it's better to move and try to avoid getting in an immediate exchange unless you're just completely out in the open and you have no other options. And in all fairness, Don, I don't know exactly where he was in proximity to anything out there.
good point.
If the armed defenders made some attempt, if he had used a verbal command and said, "Get off my property, you're trespassing," and then they came closer, that makes his argument stronger that he felt fear. If he had gone inside the house and waited for them to get closer before he opened fire, and made an attempt to retreat, that makes his argument stronger. Anything he can do, Don, to articulate what he did to warn them or to get them to leave before he engaged them with deadly force, and whether he was a warning shot or not, firing a weapon is deadly force in that type of environment.
Yeah, I think though that if he fires off a weapon, even if it's a warning shot in the sense that we're using it here now, and nobody gets hurt, then I don't think he gets prosecuted for that. Maybe, but I think it's highly unlikely that someone's going to find too much fault with that as long as nobody gets hurt. This case was kind of a mess, though, in many respects from the prosecution. They couldn't prove that it was Allen's gun that that caused the fatal wound. They didn't find a projectile. They really don't know. As I saw it, and I didn't see all the forensics, but for me, they're pretty fascinating. There was a theory that was sort of presented to the jury. We don't know who fired that round, where it came from. For all we know, a drug smuggler or a person smuggler or a random shot caused the death, and he was dragged to that location. I don't think there was very compelling forensic work done that was able to eliminate some of those alternate theories. So I think if you combine the uncertainty about what actually happened, this notion of prairie justice that you're alluding to, Sean, you put all that stuff together, and the fact that Alan Kelly and his wife seemed to be good, upstanding citizens trying to make a life for themselves, live quietly on a ranch and don't bother anybody, yet are confronted with this sort of thing daily. And whether they were in immediate danger, the fact of strangers, intruders being illegally on the property with guns certainly would give him reason for concern. So I think you put all that stuff in the pot and stir it up a little bit. You're putting all the ingredients in there for the chance of a jury nullification. Maybe in this case, 7-1. Maybe there was one person that just wasn't going to go there, and we're satisfied that it was Kelly's bullet that killed this fella, satisfied there were inconsistent statements, so as to not advance his theories credibly. Who knows? But I think you've got this sort of interesting mix. And you'll find that, I think, in self-defense cases in many instances, depending on who it is that's actually the attacker versus the attacked, and who's the defender is, and what the circumstances are.
Hey, guys, one other thing I might add just to kind of muddy the water further is that if indeed there were more than one of those migrants that was armed, and if they had warning shots fired over their head and they had just come from the river, probably the response was, I don't want to stay on the property. I want to turn around and go back the direction in which I came from. If they are in a group, that means they're probably to some extent lined up with each other. And as trainers well know, most people walk around with their fingers on the triggers of their gun. So if I turn around and I start running and there's somebody in front of me and I'm clenching my fist, it's very possible that one of those illegal migrants could have shot the deceased in the back.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And because they couldn't prove whose round it was, all those theories create reasonable doubt.
That's very plausible, though.
And that equals an acquittal if the jury does their job right.
So I don't know what guys like George Allen Kelly do in the future. Steve, what do you think? Could he have some dummy rounds of some sort, some blanks? Where is that to, you put those M80 firecrackers out in the fields to scare away the.
Here's the thing. If the guy was pointing a gun at him, then if I had no other options, this is going to sound bad. Hopefully you guys can get me out of this. My warning shot would have been straight to him, warning the others. Well, I'm trying not to be smart.
That's a terrific point. I think the defense lawyer commented that's her first shot.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. She even told the jury that she wouldn't have done the warning shot. She would have just shot them.
Yeah.
and that would actually have been a cleaner self-defense claim, frankly.
So that's a theory that the defense had, was that he was justified in using deadly force under the facts as he perceived them. And so therefore, if he could legally have shot the person that he saw with the gun that he believed was threatening him, the warning shot is legal too. It was a bad idea, probably, certainly so many. But the whole notion is, if he is faced with this deadly force threat, he has a legal right to respond with deadly force.
One of our guys said that part of his self-defense toolkit is a bullhorn that has that little siren bloop bloop on it, because he says, who has those? Authorities, police, right? And I think in a case like that, if you've got migrants, and I think the evidence pointed to that they were most likely coyotes leading people into the United States illegally. They probably weren't sex traffickers. They probably weren't mules smuggling narcotics. It can't be proven that they weren't. But I think if they think that they've been spotted by immigration, and you hear someone's voice on a loudspeaker say, you're trespassing on this property, you're illegally here, and you hear a bloop, if they don't run after that, then I think you've got a much better position to suspect that they're bad dudes.
All right, everybody, that's the podcast for today. I appreciate you listening in. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be smart, stay safe, take care.
No, they're not on his Christmas card list, you don't think?